The project I decided to do was on the McGurk effect, which is an effect we talked about in class, which pretty much talks about how everything we perceive isn't always what we perceive it to be. The reason I chose this because I thought it was interesting because we do this subconsciously, so it's cool to talk about a phenomenon that happens in our brain that we don't normally think about. And when we watched the video about it in class, I didn't realize that I was thinking in a different way. So it's cool to kind of like talk about something that we wouldn't normally realize or notice. What is the McGurk effect? So the McGurk effect is a phenomenon where we are shown a certain auditory component of a sound and the visual component is completely different. And when these two components in our brain get processed, our brain kind of decides to see something that's not really there, and we see and hear something different. So it's kind of talking about how there's two clashing components that we see, but our brain processes and perceives them to be differently than what it is. So we're not hearing what is actually being said. We're hearing what we think is being said. So we alter the sounds in our surroundings to make our brain kind of come up with this single kind of like sound that's not necessarily actually there. So, what causes the McGurk effect? So, when we think of this phenomenon, I think it doesn't really make sense because you're like, oh, I'm hearing something, and you assume that what you're hearing is going to be what is being said because that's kind of like how we live our life. It's like if I'm hearing what someone's saying, I'm going to assume that what they're saying is what they're saying. But there's two ways to kind of look at this, and the way I chose with top-down processing, there's ways our brains can process information, and one of them is top-down processing, and one of them is bottom-up processing. So top-down processing is how our brains make use of information that's already been brought into the brain by one or more of the sensory systems. So we already come in with a kind of whole picture. It's like a full picture, big picture kind of way of thinking. And then there's bottom up, which involves processing information by starting with the individual elements and building up to a picture. So it's more detail oriented. So what I decided to look at with the McGurk effect was top down processing because it's our brain kind of making this conclusion about what it's hearing and not really kind of taking the auditory component and this like physical component of what the person is saying and putting them together. It's kind of just like a whole picture of being like, okay, this is what I see, so this is what the person is saying. But bottom up processing would be more of being like, okay, the auditory component is this is what I'm hearing, this person is saying this, and then the visual component of this is what I'm they're mouthing. So this is like what they're mouthing, and that's why what I think they're saying is this. It's kind of breaking it down and focusing more on the details, while top down processing is more big picture. So I think both of these processes can be kind of attested to the McGurk effect and can be seen in the McGurk effect. Um, and then I think top-down processing has to do with it a little bit more because it's like you kind of hear something and you take you hear because you're like, oh yeah, this is what they're saying, and it's kind of like, okay, this is what I'm hearing, so this is what they're mouthing, this is what they're saying. So you take that and make that your truth. Another thing is also just speech perception because it's speech perception is pretty much how we perceive and interpret sounds and language, and that obviously has to do a big thing with the McGurk effect because it's based on what we're hearing and how we analyze what we're hearing. So the speech perception is what we're perceiving to be heard is what the person is saying. So it kind of just brings those ideas of overall how we hear things and what we're hearing is the truth. And we make that our truth. And it's like, this is what they're saying, this is what I think they're saying. So this is why this is what is being said. So an example of the McGurk effect would be like this. So if you see a video of someone and they're saying pa, and this is what we saw in class as well. So there's a video of a person and he's saying pa, and you're like pa, 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 and that's what you're hearing and you're seeing. So you're like, yes, this person is saying pa. Then in the next clip, you see someone still saying pa, but their mouth is going to be saying fa. So you're going like fa, 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 but that's just what the mouth is doing. The sound is still that same pa, but you're going to start hearing that sound alter in your brain, and you're going to be like, oh, this person is saying fa. Even though in reality, it's just a blank kind of visual of the person saying fa, fa, but not with any sound behind it. The sound is still the person saying pa. So your brain is thinking you're seeing fa, fa. So your brain kind of alters the sound and is like, oh yeah, they're saying fa. So then that's what our third thing would be is what our brain ends up interpreting is that the person is saying fa, when in reality fa that sound is not even being said. It's just being mouthed, and pa is what is being said. So that's the example of what the McGurk effect essentially is. Finally, I want to end by saying why is this important. So pretty much, I thought this quote that I found is the most perfect way to kind of bring everything together at the end and explain why it's important. So the quote is, "Seeing is not believing, it is only seeing." And I think that's really perfectly goes with the McGurk effect, because it's like what we see is not what is true or what you should believe all the time. It's kind of showing us how our brain is a lot more complex than what we think it is, and that's what the McGurk effect is. It's like spits this idea out into your head and you can't just believe it almost. You will believe it because it is what your brain is telling you, but it's not the truth or the reality of the situation. What you're hearing, like in the example that I gave in earlier in this project, it's you're hearing pa, but since you're seeing fa, you think you're saying fa. So it's cool to see how what you're seeing and hearing and perceiving is not what is actually being said. So that's how I want to end it. I think this quote ties everything up together really nicely. Thank you for listening to my project.